So let's get started. So yeah, just to double check. So yeah, this is the developer track. IT Pro track is over there. So I'm going to show you a little bit of code. If you're allergic to code, stuff like that, that might be the place for you. If not, let's get started. So we're going to be talking about Azure Active Directory and identity in general. So my name is Joonas Westlin. I also work at Composure, like the two last speakers. I work as a software developer there. So I don't do this consulting stuff that Okko does. I just work with code. Yeah, so I'm the latest Azure MVP in Finland. I was awarded last week, actually. I'm pretty active on Stack Overflow, mainly for Azure and Azure AD. Currently, I'm number 4 in the all-time rankings, actually, for Azure AD, which is pretty funny. I guess the others just aren't really that active. So you can find me on Twitter. You can find my ID there. I also have a blog at joonasw.net. I write in English about Azure, Azure AD, and also ASP.NET Core sometimes. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, you can check it out. So as for the contents of this talk, so we're going to have a short introduction to what is Azure AD, in case there are some people in the audience who don't know what Azure AD is. And we're going to look at a couple options for managing a directory, how you can do management things. And also then, because this is developer-centric, we're going to look at how to register apps in Azure AD, so no user group management, etc., only app registrations. And we're going to look at a few important settings there, so certain things which are pretty important if you're a developer to understand how those things work. Then we're going to look at a couple authentication flows. So these are different ways in which your applications can authenticate users and also get tokens to access secured APIs. And at the end, we're also going to have a demonstration with a backend web app that calls Microsoft Graph API. I know it's pretty basic, but I want to keep it a little bit simple for the sake of the demo. And we'll pray to the demo gods that everything works. Now, I would like to ask every one of you to keep your questions until the end of the presentation. So I won't take any questions in the middle because I've timed this pretty exactly, even though we do have a couple extra minutes now. Yeah. All right, so first of all, I'd like to just ask from you guys. So has anyone here had to integrate an app with Azure AD? Oh my God, there are so many of you. But yeah, it's pretty common. It's a pretty common need for organizations to use Office 365 accounts. Now I'm worried that everything that I'm going to present here is like, yeah, we know this stuff already. You should have come here with a higher level talk. Well, let's hope not. I hope that there's something for everyone here. So I have a quote from the documentation which defines Azure AD as a cloud identity service that allows developers to securely sign in users with a Microsoft Work or School account. Now, so Azure AD is the login system underneath Office 365 and Azure, to name a couple applications that use it. It's a global multi-tenant identity and access management system, among other things. It's a single sign-on system. Now what it means is for users, they sign in once, they're signed in to all services which use Azure AD. So if you, for example, log into the Azure portal with your organizational account, then you access, I don't know, Office 365 mail, for example, you'll be automatically signed in because of single sign-on, which is pretty cool. So if you've ever signed into Office 365 or Azure portal, you have used Azure AD already. And it's a little bit of unfortunate naming there, that it's named the same as Windows Server Active Directory. These two are quite different, actually. They have some similarities, between them, but basically they are pretty different beasts for different worlds. AD is really for on-premises networks, single sign-on there. Yeah, it works great. Azure AD is for cloud services, for cloud world. So managing Azure AD, personally, I use the Azure portal the most. So portal.azure.com. That's the easiest way to manage one. You just find Azure Active Directory from the left, from the list of services, and if it's not there, you can find it under all services. As a pro tip, if you didn't know about this one, there's a special portal for Azure AD, and that's aad.portal.azure.com. It only loads the Azure AD modules, so it runs way faster than the normal portal. Like, I have a pretty beefy laptop, so the normal Azure portal works fine most of the time, but like, if you have anything less, it's pretty slow sometimes. And then if you also like a command line interface, or if you need to make some scripts, then PowerShell is good for that. Now, there are a few modules for PowerShell which you can use, which is kind of sad. It can make it a little bit confusing what you should use. Personally, I would recommend to you to use the newest one, and that's the Azure AD v2 commandlets, and which there's a link there. And if you need to do some a little bit lower level stuff, or anything that you really cannot do in the portal also, for developers especially, the Azure AD Graph Explorer is a really, really nifty tool, which I've used many times. And it allows you to run REST calls against Azure AD's Graph API, allowing you to manipulate things there, to query things in various ways. It's really awesome for debugging things. So one term that I want to kind of clarify here is what is a tenant? You hear this word all the time, tenant this, tenant that. So a tenant in Azure AD is basically one Azure AD instance. So it's a container for users, for groups, users' passwords, etc. And an organization typically has one tenant. You can have more, but typically only one. And if you use Azure or Office 365, if you're able to log in there, then you already have one. And if you want, you can create more tenants from the Azure portal, which usually you might do for development purposes, like you want to have a directory just for testing stuff. I actually have like 3 for testing different things. Now, then registering apps. So let's say that you're developing an app, and we'll call it My Awesome App in this case. Yeah, great imagination I have. So when you want to then register it, you want to start integrating it with Azure AD, you'd go to the Azure Active Directory blade in the portal, and you'd find the section called App Registrations. There's actually 2 sections there which have something to do with apps, and the one that you want in this case is App Registrations. I'm not 100% approving of their naming there. It can be a little bit confusing, so yeah. But that's the place anyway. And when you go to create an app, it's going to ask you 3 things. 3 things are absolutely mandatory. A name, that's just a display name for the app. Going to be shown to the users on the login screen when they're logging in, for example. Cool. We also have a sign-on URL. That URL should usually be the URL which triggers the sign-in flow in your application. That's actually the URL given to users in this access panel, which you can find at myapps.microsoft.com. I don't know how many people have ever used this, though. Has anyone here used this? Like 2 people. All right, so they should probably just delete the whole portal. It's pretty useless then. And no, it's not. It has some nifty features, actually. Now, the name and sign-on URL are something that you can change later, so you don't really need to worry about them. So if you don't know what to put there, just do what I do. Usually when I'm developing something, just type ustv in the name, and then you type HTTP localhost for the sign-on URL. And Bob's your uncle. It's done. You can change those later, so don't worry. Maybe sometimes you don't know the URL where it's going to be hosted at that time anyway, so then you just need to put something in the URL. But the application type is something that I kind of want to discuss a little bit more. So this is one setting that you cannot change afterwards, basically. So the portal options are a little bit confusing in my opinion. So you have a choice between web app / API and native. Okay. My first thought when I started developing with Azure, when I was registering my first app, it was a scheduled Azure web job. Which one is it? Anyone know? Which one is it, by the way? Which one should it be? An Azure web job. Yeah, it's written on the slide. Seriously, guys. So, simply put, a web app / API is an app which can keep a secret. It's an app which runs on a device that you control. So a user cannot take a memory dump of the process or access the files, access the source code. That's the point of the type. So things like APIs, backend web applications, and also Azure Web Jobs, scheduled jobs, which run on your controlled devices. Those would be there. Native apps, however, cannot keep secrets because they run on a user's device. So if you put like a secret key there, someone's gonna find it. I've seen people use obfuscation in mobile apps to hide secret keys. It doesn't work. Someone is going to find it. So the point of it is that if you have like a mobile app, anything that runs on a user's device, that should be registered as a native app here. Sadly, I've seen people do it a little bit differently. So a native apps also includes, single-page JavaScript apps. Because, it runs on the user's device, if you haven't realized. Like the JavaScript runs in the browser, on the user's laptop or computer, right? And this selection actually is just a Boolean is actually just a Boolean property on the application object called public client. So a public client is a native app. Yeah, it's a public client because it's available there. A confidential client would be the web app type. Now, after we've created the app, we can access its properties. And one really, really important setting there is multi-tenanted, which by default is set to no, which means that your app is single tenant. What it means is that only users who are in that same Azure AD can log into the app. So this can usually be organizations' line of business apps, where you want your organization to be able to log in with their own accounts, right? No one else can log in there. Then we have, if you set it to yes, then at that point your app becomes a multi-tenant app, right? And now, a user from any Azure AD tenant, anywhere on the planet, can log in to your app. So think like software as a service apps, right? You want your customers, your users, to be able to use their own accounts to log into the app. So that's a multi-tenant app. Now, multi-tenant apps have some special considerations that you need to make when developing it. I'm not going to go too deep into those right now, but you can check out the links later if you want. The documentation on those is pretty good, and there's also sample apps for that. Some things that you need to do a little bit differently on the app side. Another really, really important thing for apps is reply URLs. So that's the set of URLs where Azure AD is allowed to send the user back after they log in. So your app sends the user to log in Azure AD, and it says, hey, once the user's logged in, send them here. Now that URL where they are sent to must be one of these. So if you get some kind of error there that says something, redirect URL, something, it's probably a problem with these. And the reason why this exists is because the redirect can contain users' personal information in a token, so you don't want those things to go to evil.com. Then we have another important one, which is application keys. And so native apps cannot have these, because you can't have secrets in native apps. So these can either be client secrets, which are called passwords here, or these can be public keys from key pairs that you generate. So either can be used then for the application to authenticate itself, right? A user has a password with which they authenticate themselves. This is the application's password, by which it tells Azure AD that yes, I am this app who I tell I am. And I put it there in all caps. I probably should have increased the font size a little bit and made it red or something. But it really should go without saying that you should not be putting these things on code that runs on a user's device. Like, it was a kind of funny one. I saw a question on Stack Overflow actually, why this is not working. I have this JavaScript single page app, and I'm calling the token endpoint from here, from this JavaScript code, and here's the client secret and stuff. And by the way, the best part was the client secret was in the question on Stack Overflow. Usually my comments on bad questions are pretty nice. That time I was not nice. So don't do that, seriously. It's a really bad idea, because someone can then do nasty things. Now, if your application then needs to access things like, for example, in their Office 365 account, like their files in OneDrive for Business or their emails in Outlook, anything like that, your application can actually require permissions on APIs. Those APIs can be Microsoft APIs, they can be APIs that you made, they can be APIs that another third party made. There are two types of permissions. First one is application permissions, and those will always give your app organization-wide access to something. Essentially, they are saying that this app by itself can access this thing. For example, give the app the permission to read every user's emails. It's a pretty scary thought, right? But there's actually really valid use cases for those kind of things. Then we also have delegated permissions, and those give your app access as a single user. So for example, to access the emails of the currently signed in user. And that's a little bit more granular, right? It's not like whole organization. So I prefer using delegated permissions whenever possible, but sometimes it's not. They have their downsides too. Now, one thing that you should always keep in mind is that when you require a permission through that dialog there, you're only saying that this app requires this. You haven't given it the permissions yet. You haven't granted it access yet. So a user can consent to the permissions when they log in. That's one option. So they'll get like a screen which says, like, well, this app, my awesome app, requires access to your email, for example. And then the user can choose to approve those permissions or not. Or there's also this nice little button in the Azure portal which appeared sometime late last year, I think, which says grant permissions. And so if you're an administrator in Azure AD, you can actually just click that, and that does consent for your whole organization, the whole tenant. No one will be asked for consent anymore because an administrator said it's okay. And for certain permissions, you actually need administrator consent. Like, for example, every single application permission requires administrator consent. A normal user cannot grant those. So it's one of the biggest causes of problems people have, actually, is that they have forgotten to grant the permissions, especially with application permissions. Now, when you make an app, it typically needs to do one or both of these things. It might need to authenticate a user, and it might also need to call secured APIs, right? Or it might only make calls to APIs if it's just some kind of scheduled job, for example. There are various flows that exist for this purpose, and these are made for different scenarios and different application types. So if you have a mobile app, you use a different one. If you have a back-end web app, you use a different one. You have a single-page JavaScript app, different one. Okay. So I'm going to give a couple examples, and these are from the OpenID Connect and OAuth specifications, which are protocols commonly used in modern apps for authentication and authorization. Basically, that's all I use personally. You don't really need to, of course, worry too much about the implementation of those protocols, about talking with Azure AD, because there are common libraries for the most popular languages and frameworks. So you don't need to roll your own authentication, which is usually a bad idea. And if you're talking to Azure AD, you're probably familiar with ADAL, Azure AD Authentication Library, and it exists for all of those languages and platforms that you see there. So they got pretty much every platform covered. Now, Azure AD does support WS Federation and SAML, which are other authentication protocols, but I'm not going to go into those right now because those are a little bit out of scope. So when we talk about Azure AD authentication with OpenID Connect and OAuth, we have to talk about tokens, the tokens that it supports. So the tokens there are JSON Web Tokens, or JOTs as they are usually called. Has anyone here handled these before? Quite many. Good. So most of you already know how these look like. So in Azure AD we have two types of tokens. We have ID tokens, which contain some information about the user, like their display name, first name, last name, email, certain small things, and those can be gotten by your app after a user signs in. Then we also have access tokens, and these are used by your app to call an API. So you want to call Microsoft Graph API, for example, you need an access token. You want to call another API, you need an access token. And an access token is always only valid for one API. So if you need to call two APIs, which are protected by Azure AD, you need two access tokens. And an access token can also contain user info. It depends how you acquire it. If you acquire it after a user logs in, then it will be done with a user context. So it will also include the user's information as well as the app's information which acquired the token. So there's one really super important parameter there which you really should know how that works. So when you acquire access tokens, you have to specify which API you want to call, right? I'm going to call Microsoft Graph API. Then you need to set the resource to this URI here, which is graph.microsoft.com. It just so happens that it's the same as the API's URL, actually. But that's just the identifier for the API. If you make an API and you want to get a token for it, you can find that API's app ID URI in its properties and use that. You can also use the client ID, actually, if you want. But I commonly use that one. If you haven't seen a JSON Web Token before, here's how they look like. So when you get a JSON Web Token, it's base 64 encoded, so it's just a stream of characters. It's completely unreadable, like you can't make any sense of it. So I recommend you use a tool like jot.ms, which allows you to decode the access tokens and ID tokens, and actually tells you what is contained in it, and it's also going to explain to you what those things in there are, which is quite cool. So these tokens contain a set of claims. A claim is just a property, kind of key pair value, like here's like audience and this GUID. That's a claim. So on the left side we actually have an ID token, which contains some facts about the user. So you can see things like family name, given name, and also display names. Certain other identifiers for the user, like their user principal name, which is their login name. Then we have an access token, and this one actually doesn't even fit on the screen. It has quite a lot of information, and the reason for that is that this was acquired with the user context. So it has the application information as well as the user information. So in this case, the Microsoft Graph API is going to know who is the calling application and who is the user using that application. So it can then apply permissions and filters on the data as appropriate. And the reason why I know this is for Microsoft Graph API, because the audience there says graph.microsoft.com at the top. All right. Final thing before the demo. I'm going to talk about a couple authentication flows. The first one is authorization code flow. So this is mainly used by back-end web applications. So when you have a kind of traditional web application, which doesn't have like a fancy JavaScript front end, then you might use this one. And it all starts with the app redirecting the user to the Azure AD login page, which you'll see in a moment. And after the user logs in, goes through multi-factor authentication, logs into their on-premises account, whatever. Your app doesn't need to care. But once they do that, your app gets back an authorization code. And your app can then exchange this code plus a couple other things, which must include client secret or certificate used there. It can then get an ID token, access token, and a refresh token. So we already talked about ID tokens and access tokens. Now refresh tokens are then used to get new access tokens, because access tokens have an expiry time. They expire. So a refresh token can then be used to get a new one once that happens. So the user doesn't need to log in again, right? So it does require a little bit of what we call an OpenID Connect dance. So there's like this thing going there, you get this thing here, you then send this and this thing there, and you get this and this thing back. Really simple, right? There's a reason for the complexity, though. It's mainly security. Your app cannot see the user's password because they enter it in Azure AD's login page, right? The user can't do anything useful with the authorization code, which they could take from the redirect, right? But when used in combination with the client ID and secret in the backend, you can get access tokens. So the user cannot see your application's password. And the user also can't get access to the access token, for example, which frankly doesn't really matter. I mean, you're acting as them on the API anyway, so even if they get it, well, I mean, they can't do anything they couldn't do otherwise. In this case, delegated permissions are going to apply because we are doing the authentication in a user context. So application permissions do not apply here. But the case where application permissions do apply is client credentials. And this is when you have some kind of like a script or scheduled web job, something that needs to run and authenticate as itself to Azure AD. This is much simpler. The app sends its client ID and secret to the token endpoint, it gets back an access token. Boom, done. Super simple. But yeah, requires use of application permissions, which you remember are organization-wide. So it's up to the job to decide what it does with that token, or which user it accesses, which user's calendars it deletes. Has never happened. There's a couple other authentication flows. I say couple, but yeah, like it's massive wall of text. But we have implicit flow, which is for single-page JavaScript apps. It's pretty cool. And we also have a device code flow, which is for kind of text-only clients. So think like you have like a command line interface, or some kind of like a Raspberry Pi where you're connected over SSH, something, where you can't like go to a web browser to log in because you don't have a graphical interface at all, right? So I wrote a blog post about it, so you can go check that out. And there's also on behalf of flow, which allows your API to call another API on behalf of the calling user, which is pretty cool. So when you get a call as a user to your API, you can call Microsoft Graph API, for example, as dem. So that allows you to kind of chain the delegation. So I wrote a blog article on that as well. Then we have this thing called Resource Owner Password Credentials Grant Flow. Rolls right off your tongue, which more commonly called the ROPC flow. In it, basically, you can do what is known as a non-interactive authentication by using username, password, client ID, client secret to get tokens as the user. But in this case, the user has to enter their password in your app. And I would recommend you not to do that, not to use it. And Scott Brady wrote a whole blog article on it. That's how much he hates it. It's a pretty good article also. He has a lot of good arguments for him. But yeah, basically just don't use it, unless you really have to. There are some use cases for it. All right, let's get to the demo. So I actually have a couple links here. So they're using my URL shortener, westlin.in. /AAD demo and /AAD repo. So AAD demo is actually a link to my demo application hosted in Azure. It's multi-tenant. So if you want to try it, you can log in with your own organizational account there and kind of see how my app works there. And AAD repo is a link to my GitHub repository, which has the source code for this demo. All right, it's on duplicate automatically. Nice. All right, so here you can see that I'm an amazing graphical designer. It's using the default template and everything. It has like one H1 on the page. Our company's graphical designer would probably yell at me a little bit for this one, but he won't see the recording, right? So I have it running here locally on my laptop for this one, so I can show you how it works in my code as well. And first thing I'm going to do is actually open up the network tab here in Firefox so that you can actually see what is happening. So if I just click login right now, okay, what happens? It goes here to Azure AD's login page. And the reason I know that is because it says login.microsoftonline.com there. So that's Azure AD's login page. And you can actually see the redirect here as well. So we get a 302 from my app, which says, don't come here, go there, to the browser. All right, so then once we pick this account to log in, I'm just going to get my password from here. And sign in. Now, before we go here, actually I just want to show you what is happening here in the browser. So after logging in, it's actually making a HTTP post to my application. And for some reason, Firefox is not showing me the parameters. Okay, that's fine. But it's sending my app that authorization code, which I mentioned. So we can actually see it here. We have this protocol message.code here. And you can see that it's just this chunk of text. That's the authorization code. And here we are using ADAL to acquire a token. So first here we created some credentials because we have to use our secret to get that token, right? And we also created a token cache. That cache is used by ADAL to, cache the access tokens and refresh tokens, so then your app doesn't really need to worry about all that. Like you can just ask ADAL to give you an access token and it will try to find it in cache first. So we create one and then we create an authentication context, which is ADAL's main class, which it uses for all of this authentication stuff. And we then specify which API we want a token for. So we say HTTPS graph Microsoft.com. Microsoft Graph API. And we call acquire token by authorization code. So the name of the function pretty much says it all. We want a token, and we want to use an authorization code to get it. So we need to give it the code, we need to give it the current URL, the credentials, and that resource. And if that succeeds, we get back an access token and an ID token. So I'm just going to show you how that access token looks. So it's not very readable if you look at it like this, but if we actually copy it from here, and I go to jot.ms, and I paste it in here, we actually get a helpful tip that this is actually an Azure AD v1 token instead of a v2 token. And it decodes the token for us. So the token is not encrypted, by the way. It's just encoded. And we can see certain facts about the user there. So that's the access token for Microsoft Graph. And we can see my name there, for example. And the reason why I like jot.ms is because it has this claims tab. So you can actually learn what all those claims mean, like what is the audience claim, for example, like what it actually means. And why another thing actually, because you might see that in the token there's this expiry time. So those of you who use Linux a lot might be able to just immediately know, oh yeah, that's 1 hour later from now. That's a Unix timestamp. But for those of us who are a little bit weaker with that side, we have this thing here which just tells us Thursday, March 15th, 7:29 in your time zone. So it's quite nice that it actually kind of decodes that as well. So it's actually 1 hour and 5 minutes, the time. All right, so let's just let this through from here. So if I then go back to the app, I can actually, now I can see what the Azure AD sent us back. So there you can actually also see the authorization code being posted. And now at this point, we have established a session with the user. So all those claims that we got from Azure AD are now stored in a cookie, which is kept by our browser here. So if I now go to this user claims tab, it's going to list out all of those claims which are available on every request that this user makes to the app. So now we know the user's username, for example. But I have this other tab here as well, which is MS Graph Test. So what it's going to do is that it's going to request for my profile from the Microsoft Graph API. So if I click on it, you can see that I hit this action here. And so we're going to query the /me resource in Graph. I can also show you what that does. So we're just making an HTTP request to the beta endpoint of Microsoft Graph. We're getting an access token. And in this case, we're going to get it from ADAL with this acquire token silent function. And what that does is basically tells ADAL, get me a token from cache. Or if the access token has expired, use the refresh token which you have there to get another one. And then give me that one. Now, if both of those fail, there will be an exception thrown from there. So then you got to do something about that. But yeah, I can show you that in a bit if we have time. So we get the access token from cache. In this case, it's the same one that I already showed. We attach it to the request as the authentication header and send the request. So we're done. And we have our response. So I can actually show you how that looks like here with the JSON visualizer. So here we have, for example, my user's unique identifier in Azure AD and all of these different other things like extension properties, things that you don't get in the ID token. Then we're going to make that response a little bit prettier and show it on the view. And what we also do in this view is we request for the user's profile photo. So that's just an IMG element in there, which is calling again on another action in here, and that's here. So that's going to do the exact same thing. It's going to go to /me/photo/$value, which is going to give you the photo, like the bytes of the photo, like the file. And we're going to read it as a stream and just pass it on to the client. And if all works, there's probably a problem with the internet. Okay, we'll come back to that. Anyway, what I would want to show you as well is this thing. So you remember I mentioned that if it fails to get that access token, an exception is going to be thrown. So you don't want to show an error page to your users in that case, because what really has happened is that the user tried to access some page and they had a valid session with your app, but you no longer have an access token for them. So you would want to re-authenticate them instead. So what we do there is that we have this exception filter. This is an ASP.NET Core app, by the way. I probably should have mentioned that like 15 minutes ago. But what we do there is that we check the exception. If it's an ADAL silent token acquisition exception, we change the result to a challenge result, which then triggers the authentication flow. So we automatically then just re-authenticate the user, and they don't see an error or anything. Oh yeah, and the photo loaded as well. That's great. And yeah, so this is that one which I mentioned, which was over there. So if you can't remember the short URL, it's actually just core aaddemo.azurewebsites.net, and you can log in there with any Azure AD account and test out the exact same things which I did. So, as a quick summary, Azure AD and identity are in general quite hard topics. There's a lot of complexity involved when you're doing these kind of things. And my suggestion for you guys is to practice, and go through example apps. So there's loads of sample apps on GitHub and elsewhere as well, which you can access. And I'm going to have a link to those as well. And the apps that Visual Studio generates are pretty good samples as well. So if you make a new ASP.NET Core application in Visual Studio, for example, you have the option of choosing organizational authentication for that. And that's going to actually register an app in your Azure AD, and it's going to configure the app and do everything, basically, for you. It's pretty great. And you can learn a lot from that. And if you have trouble, ask on Stack Overflow. I will answer, probably. Or if I'm sleeping, it's going to be one of the Chinese Microsoft support guys. One or the other. There's a few things which I couldn't cover today, which I would have liked to talk about, but obviously we had a lot of things in this presentation as well, so it's probably for the best that we didn't cover them. So we have, for example, B2C, which is a customer-oriented version of Azure AD, which allows your customers to log in with their social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, whatnot. It's quite good for that. And we also have the new version 2 endpoint. So all of the examples which I'm showing here are for version 1, which is the classic endpoint. Version 2 is still kind of a work in progress. So yeah, it's still not quite finalized, and it's missing a lot of features still. But you can check it out if you want. And also, of course, IT Pro topics, because, well, this is the dev track, so I didn't talk about multi-factor authentication, for example, which is really, really awesome. It's really easy to set up for users. You just literally say, require MFA for all of these guys, and done. And we also have on-premises synchronization with AAD Connect, so that allows you to synchronize user accounts from on-premises Active Directory, so the users can use the same accounts in cloud and on-prem. And now as devs, you shouldn't be expected to know how to configure it, but it's slightly painful, I can tell you from experience. But you should know, at least on a high level, what it does. And then also pricing, you can find there. So there's a couple different tiers for licenses for Azure AD. But if you create an Azure AD tenant in Azure portal, then that's going to be on the free tier by default. So don't worry. And you can have like a maximum of 50,000 objects in that directory. That counts things like users, groups, applications, and so on. So you can do a lot of stuff for free. You just don't get some things like branding. So here's a set of links. So we're surely going to make these presentations available later. So don't worry about writing this down right now. So there's some links to documentation, some sample apps. I also included Microsoft Graph API documentation because why not? And also my posts on Azure AD you can find there. So, okay, so we have 3 minutes for questions. Shoot.
Is there a reason why you're using ADAL instead of the newer MSAL?
So the question was why are we using ADAL instead of the newer MSAL? So ADAL is for the version 1 endpoint, which I'm using here. So MSAL is the newer library for the V2 endpoint, which I mentioned is still a little bit of a work in progress. MSAL is also a little bit of a work in progress still. So the reason I'm not using it is because I'm using the version 1 endpoint.
So what are the main missing features from the V2 endpoint?
Missing features from V2, those would be some authentication flows, like on behalf of, which was mentioned there, and a huge lack of APIs that you can call. It's basically just Microsoft Graph API and your own app's API and nothing else. Those would be the main things. Yeah.
The multi-factor auth is like pretty limited right now. I think it's email and SMS.
I think it's not even emails. Everything is phone. It's just text message call or authenticator app. I think.
So do you know if they have any like plans to support other things like Google Authenticator?
No, I do not. Was there a question over there? Any more questions? Oh, there.
If I want to decode my access token,
Yeah.
like you showed it,
Yeah.
I would go to Google and search for something like decode JSON web token.
Yeah.
And the first result would be eagle.com, which I would paste my access token into. So what kind of risks am I exposed to?
Well, for then, yeah. So access tokens should only be sent over a secure channel. That's a kind of good point over there also, because anyone who has the access token can call that API using that access token, because that's the only authentication there is. So if someone has that, they can make that authenticated call instead of the user and the app. So you got to trust that site a little bit. Yeah, that is true. But I like jot.ms because actually the token never leaves your browser. The decoding is actually done fully in JavaScript, and like you can look at the network tab if you're paranoid. I had a question there.
Yeah. Is there any way for delegating to Azure AD managing the roles of my application?
So you have roles in your application and you would like to manage them in Azure AD. Yes.
Basically, I don't want to implement role management.
Yeah, so that is true. So there is a certain level of role management in Azure AD as well. So you can define user roles in apps in Azure AD. I actually have a whole blog post on that, so you can check that out if you want. And then you can actually have the administrator assign those roles to users. And if you have a paid license, you can assign those roles to groups, which is also, of course, pretty nice because it allows you to do it a little bit easier. We're out of time now, sadly, so if you have more questions, then feel free to come talk to me later. Yeah, thanks a lot.